Tonight, we travel back some 600 years to the far side of the world and the warm southern coast of China, and a fleet of ships so large that, even now, it hardly seems it could have been real. There was a man who built that fleet and sailed it to the edges of the known world and then brought it safely home again. His name we will come to. For now, it is enough to know that he began his life as a boy in the mountains, very far from any sea, and ended it as the admiral of the greatest fleet that had ever sailed upon the earth. There is no need to remember any of this. No need to hold on to the names or the dates or the places. They will drift past you through the night like ships passing in the dark, and you can let every one of them go. You do not have to keep a single thing. You can simply listen and let the night grow quiet around you. Let your shoulders soften. Let the bed take your weight. Feel the warmth of the blankets and the quiet of the room and the slow and easy rhythm of your own breathing. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Only this quiet room and a slow story and the long, gentle road down into sleep. Take one slow breath if you like, and let it go. And let us begin. So, 600 years ago, and a little more. In the high, far southwest of China, in a province of misted mountains called Yunnan, a boy was born into a Muslim family. They were people with long memories and far horizons folded into those memories. For his father and his father's father before him had made the great pilgrimage west, all the way to Mecca, across deserts and mountains and seas that the boy, in his green and quiet valley, could only try to picture. They had gone to the very ends of the world they knew, and come home again, carrying the memory of all that distance. So even there, in those landlocked hills, with no ocean for 1,000 miles in any direction, the idea of distance was in him from the very start. The sense that the world was enormous, that it stretched on and on far beyond the last blue ridge of the mountains, and that a person, an ordinary person, might set out across it and see its far edges and return. The boy's name in those early years was He, a child of the mountains in a quiet province at the soft green edge of a vast empire. He could not have known what was coming. None of us ever can. His childhood did not stay gentle for very long. In those years, the new rulers of China, a dynasty called the Ming, were finishing the long and difficult work of taking the whole country under their hand. And Yunnan, his home, far away in the southwest, was the very last region to hold out against them. And so, in time, the war came even there, up into the misted hills, and in the way of those hard old times when the armies had marched through and the fighting was done, the boy, perhaps 10 years old, was taken from his home. I will tell you this part softly, because it is sad, and because you do not need to carry it with you into sleep. As so often happened to captured boys in that age, a thing we would find very hard now, he was taken into the service of the imperial household, made, as such boys were, a servant who would spend his life inside palace walls. And he was carried far away to the north, away from the mountains, away from his family, away from everything green and familiar that he had ever known, and given into the household of a young prince. It could so easily have been the end of him. A small, quiet life, lost somewhere in the endless corridors of a palace. A name no one would ever have written down. That is what became of most such boys. They vanished into the great machinery of the empire, and history never noticed them at all. But it was not the end of him. Far from it. Because the boy was clever, and he was steady, and he was brave. He grew tall and strong, and by every account that survives, he carried himself with a kind of calm that drew people to him. And the young prince he had been given to serve came slowly over the years to trust him completely. They were not so far apart in age. They grew toward manhood alongside one another. The prince and the watchful, capable servant from the southern mountains. And when, after long years of patience, a sudden and bitter war broke out within the ruling family itself, a nephew against an uncle for the throne of all of China, the servant from Yunnan rode at the prince's side through all of it, and he proved himself again and again in the worst of it. And the prince won, and made himself the emperor of all China. History would come to call him the Yongle Emperor, and when he climbed at last onto that highest of all thrones, he did not forget the quiet, steady man who had stood beside him through everything. He gave him a new name as a mark of the highest honor. He took away the family name of Ma, the name of the mountain boy, and he gave him instead the name Zheng. And so the captured child from the green valleys of the southwest became the man that all of history would remember, Zheng He. You do not need to hold any of these names. Let them be soft sounds drifting through the quiet dark. The boy who was taken, the prince who became an emperor, the old name set down and the new name given, like a door swinging slowly open onto everything that was about to happen. Because the new emperor had an idea so large that it would take thousands of people years simply to build. And he had found, in this calm and capable man who had served him so long, exactly the person to carry it out into the world. The idea was the sea. China in those days already knew the southern oceans well enough. For many centuries, merchant ships had carried silk and porcelain south and west across the water and brought back spices and gems and the goods of distant lands. The sea roads were old and well-traveled. But what this emperor imagined was something on an entirely different scale. Not a handful of trading ships, slipping quietly out to do their business and slipping quietly home. He imagined a fleet, an armada, a floating city of ships, a fleet so vast and so splendid, so far beyond anything that had ever been seen upon the water, that wherever it should appear upon the horizon, every port in all the world would understand in a single breathless glance the wealth and the reach and the sheer overwhelming grandeur of Ming China, and the building of this fleet, and the command of it, and the long voyages it would make to the very ends of the earth, he gave to Zheng He, the man who, as a boy in his mountains, had never once in his life so much as seen the ocean. Let yourself rest there a moment before we go down to the water. Settle a little deeper into the warmth. There is no hurry at all. The story will wait for you. has waited 600 years already. It can wait while you find the most comfortable stillness and let your breathing slow, and let the day you have had drift away behind you like a far and fading shore. Good. Now, let us go down to the water slowly and watch the great thing being made. Picture a broad river city in the warm Chinese south. Its docks crowded for miles along a wide brown river, the kind of river so large it moves like something alive, sliding steadily down toward the distant sea. And there, along its banks, in great timber shipyards, the most ambitious building project of the entire age was taking shape, slowly, over years. The ships they built there had a name. They were called the treasure ships, and by the old records, the very largest of them were giants. So large, in truth, that scholars still argue about it now, 6 centuries later, over whether the numbers written down can possibly be literally true. Vessels said to be longer than anything that had ever sailed before, with great ribbed sails like the wings of vast birds, and rows of towering masts, and clever sealed compartments down beneath the waterline, so that even if one part of the hull were breached, the water could not spread, and the whole ship would not go down. Whether they were quite so enormous as the oldest chronicles claim, we will never truly know. But on this, everyone agrees. They were vast, floating wooden castles, painted in deep reds and golds, carved and lacquered, riding higher out of the water than the houses on the shore behind them. And there were not only the treasure ships. Around those great vessels, the shipyards built every other kind of ship that a voyage of years might possibly need. There were ships whose holds were great tanks for carrying fresh water, enough to keep thousands of people alive far out on the salt sea. There were ships built to carry horses, ships heavy with grain and rice and all the food a floating town would eat in a year. There were ships for soldiers and ships for trade goods, and ships whose only task in all the world was to carry supplies for all the other ships. A whole fleet of every shape and size, hundreds upon hundreds of vessels, slowly gathering at the river's wide mouth. Imagine the work of it. The smell of cut timber and pine pitch and smoke. The endless sound of hammers and adzes and saws rolling along the riverbank from dawn until dark. Whole forests of seasoned wood floated down the rivers and stacked in great yards. The huge curved ribs of a hull rising up like the bones of some enormous animal. And then the planking going on, plank by patient plank. Rope walks where men twisted mile after mile of cordage. Sail lofts where the great sails were stitched. Thousands and thousands of carpenters and smiths and rope makers and sail makers, all of them bent to the one vast task, year after year, of building a fleet to astonish the world. And by the old records, that first great fleet, when at last it was ready, carried more than 300 ships, and aboard them some 27,000 men, an entire town, a small city, really, lifted up off the land and set down upon the water and pointed out toward the open horizon. Let yourself rest there a while, on the riverbank, in the warm air, watching it all take shape. The masts going up, one after another, against a pale and hazy sky. The hammering far off and soft and steady, like a heartbeat. There is nowhere you need to be. nothing to do but watch the ships being born. And then, at last, after all those years, the waiting was over. The fleet was finished. The holds were full. The great sails were bent onto their masts. And the season turned as the sailors had known it would. And the wind that blows across those warm seas each year, the wind they had been waiting for, the way you might wait for a tide, began at last to blow steadily toward the south. They called it the monsoon, and it was the breath that would carry the whole enormous fleet out into the world. Imagine the morning that they left. The wide river crowded with ships from one green bank to the other. The enormous sails unfurling slowly, one after another, red and gold, and the soft brown of canvas filling and stiffening as the wind took hold of them. Drums sounding out across the water, deep and slow, the signal to make way. And then the treasure ships themselves swinging out, one by one, into the river's steady current, riding low and heavy and impossibly magnificent, and streaming out behind them all the hundreds of smaller ships, like a great flock of birds following the slow giants that led them, and the whole vast fleet turning together toward the south, toward the open sea, toward the warm and waiting horizon and all the unknown ports that lay somewhere far beyond it. 27,000 souls going out together onto the wide water, and standing at the head of all of them, the calm man from the mountains, the boy who had been taken from his home and made a servant, and who now commanded the greatest fleet the world had ever known. Let the fleet carry you out, now, gently, away from the land. There is nothing for you to do but drift along with it, out past the river's mouth, out where the brown water turns at last to blue and the shore falls away behind, and there is only the sea and the sky and the warm, steady wind. The voyages would last for months and then for years. There would be 7 of them in all, spread across nearly 30 years of sailing. And out there, on the open ocean, far from the sight of any shore, life aboard the great ships settled into its own slow and patient rhythm. They found their way across all that trackless water by the oldest and the newest of arts, woven together. By the compass, first of all, the little floating needle that, however the ship might turn, always swung itself back to point steadily toward the south. It was a Chinese invention, the compass, older than these voyages by many centuries. And it was the quiet, faithful heart of their navigation, and by the stars as well. For the navigators of the fleet knew the night sky the way that you know the rooms of your own home in the dark. They had instruments to measure the height of certain chosen stars above the black line of the horizon. And from those careful measurements, taken night after night, they could tell how far north or south the fleet had wandered upon the face of the deep. And so, under the same great wheel of turning stars that you might see tonight, were you to rise and look, the huge ships felt their slow way across the immensity of the ocean. And the ocean was not always gentle with them. There were storms, of course. There must have been many. Nights when the sea rose up black and enormous, and the rain came slashing sideways, and the wind screamed in the rigging, and the lanterns swung wild, and even those vast ships were tossed like leaves upon the heaving dark. In such hours, the sailors prayed. They had a goddess they turned to, a gentle and watchful protector of all those who go out upon the sea, and they trusted her to bring them through the dark. And when they came safely home again, at the end of all their voyaging, they raised great carved stones in her honor, covered in their careful thanks for having carried them through the storms and home alive. But mostly, in the long memory of it, there were not the storms. Mostly, there were the calm days, day after gentle day of them, the endless rolling blue, stretching away unbroken to the edge of the world on every side. The warm wind, steady and constant in the sails, the soft and ceaseless sound of the water sliding past the hull, hour upon hour upon hour, and the thousands of men aboard going quietly about the patient work of keeping a floating town alive and moving, far, far out upon the breathing sea. Picture one of those long, calm days, if you like, and let it slow you down. The huge sail above, gently bellied with the wind. The deck rising and falling, slowly, slowly, on the long ocean swell, like something breathing in its sleep. The wide blue all around, the warm sun. Nothing to do but go on and on toward the south, with all the time in the world. You may be settling now. Good. That is exactly right. Let the calm days carry you the way they carried the fleet. And then, after weeks of nothing but water, there would come a morning when the lookouts high up on the masts began to cry out, "Land, land ahead." A green coast rising slowly from the sea. And the great fleet would turn and come gliding in toward another port, in another country, full of people who had never in all their lives imagined that such a sight could exist. For the fleet did not sail out into empty, unknown waters. We should be honest about that. These were ancient sea roads, traveled for more than 1,000 years already by Arab and Indian and Malay and Persian sailors in their own fine ships. The ports the fleet came to were old and rich and busy, crowded with people and goods from 100 lands. Zheng He was no lonely discoverer, finding blank places on an empty map. But even so, even in those old and worldly harbors, nothing remotely like this had ever before come up over the horizon. Hundreds of ships at once, sails like great moving walls upon the sea, and the towering painted treasure ships riding high above every other vessel in the water, vast beyond anything those ports had ever seen or dreamed. Picture those harbors gently, one melting softly into the next, the way that places do in a dream as you drift down towards sleep. There were the spice harbors of the warm southern islands, where the wharves were piled high with pepper and clove and nutmeg and cinnamon, and the very air itself was thick and sweet and heavy with the smell of them. There was a great trading city that stood upon a narrow strait, a city the Chinese fleet helped to protect and to raise up into wealth, where the goods of half the world changed hands in its crowded markets. There was the long and brilliant coast of India, with its ancient ports loud and bright and hot, the stalls hung with cottons and silks, and the warm yellow glint of worked gold. And everywhere, in every harbor, the same astonishment as the impossible ships came gliding in, and the little boats rowed out from shore to meet them, and the splendid strangers from across the world stepped down at last onto the wharves, and they came in peace. That is the thing to hold on to, if you hold on to anything at all tonight. They came to trade, and to honor, and to be honored, not to conquer, not to seize, not to build empires upon other people's shores. They carried with them the very finest things that China could make. Porcelain so fine and so thin that you could hold it up and see the light come glowing through it. Silk in deep and shining colors that those ports had never seen the likes of. Gold and lacquerwork and crafts of every kind made by the most skilled hands in the world. And they traded all of it, gladly, for the treasures of the South and the West. Spices by the shipload, precious gems, ivory, fragrant woods and rare medicines, and strange and wonderful animals to carry home for the wonder of the emperor's court. And the fleet carried something else too on its long, slow journeys home. It carried people, ambassadors, envoys sent by all those distant kings and sultans, invited to sail back across the world to China to stand before the emperor in his own great court, and to see for themselves, with their own astonished eyes, the heart of the empire that had been able to send such a fleet across the whole of the ocean to their shores. Let yourself wander those warm harbors a little in the soft dark before we sail on. The smell of spice and salt and smoke. The bright hung cloth stirring in the sea wind. The crowds and the calling voices in a dozen tongues, and the little boats and the towering ships. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing at all that you need to remember. Just the bright ports drifting slowly past, and the patient ships, and the warm wind carrying you on. And on the later voyages, the fleet sailed farther still, out past the southern tip of India and across the wide open reach of the Indian Ocean, all the way to the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and the great rich trading port that stood there like a gate, and on, along the dry and ancient coast of Arabia, sailing near the holy cities of Zheng He's own faith, the faith he had carried with him all the way from a mountain valley in China, and on again, farther than any of it, all the way to the distant coast of Africa, to the old stone trading towns strung along that eastern shore, where, to this very day, fragments of Chinese porcelain still lie buried in the sand, dropped there 600 years ago. That was the very edge of the world that the Chinese court knew anything about. About as far from the green misted mountains of Yunnan as a living person of that age could possibly travel and still, somehow, find his way home. And there is one thing that the fleet brought back from those far African coasts that I have always loved more than almost anything else in this whole long story. Because it is gentle, and it is a little funny, and it is entirely, wonderfully true. They brought home a giraffe. Imagine it for a moment. A creature impossibly tall, with its long and impossibly slow neck, and its strange, soft, dark eyes, and its patient, gangling, careful walk. Caught somewhere on the warm plains of Africa and led down to the sea and lifted somehow into the hold of a treasure ship and carried across thousands and thousands of miles of open ocean all the way from the grasslands of Africa to the imperial court of China. And when it was at last led, blinking and bewildered, down the gangway and into that ancient court, the scholars and the officials gathered there looked up at it in pure astonishment, and they decided in their wonder that it could only be one thing: a creature out of their own oldest and most sacred legends. A gentle, magical beast, a being of good omen, said to appear in the world only during the reign of a truly good and truly wise and truly virtuous ruler. A sign sent down from heaven itself to say that all was well and that the one upon the throne was blessed. They had a name in their old stories for such a beast, and they greeted the tall, mild, gentle, thoroughly confused animal from the far plains of Africa as exactly, precisely that. A living sign of heaven's own favor walked carefully down a wooden gangway on its long and delicate legs. The emperor was overjoyed. The whole court rejoiced. Poems were written. It was taken as proof that the heavens themselves smiled upon all that they were doing. A giraffe, mistaken with the most touching sincerity for a heaven-sent miracle. Let that drift slowly through you in the dark with the beginning of a smile. It is, I think, one of the kindest and gentlest small moments in all of human history. And there was a real kindness, too, in the man himself, out there at the head of all that staggering power. In one island port, upon his travels, Zheng He, who had been raised from birth in the Muslim faith, left behind him a single carved stone. And upon that one stone, written out carefully in 3 different languages, he set down his thanks and his offerings to 3 entirely different gods: to the Buddha, and to Allah, and to a god of the local people of that island. 3 faiths, 3 peoples, honored together side by side in peace upon one quiet stone by a man standing at the very edge of the known world. He had room enough inside him, it seems, for all of it. There is something in that small stone worth carrying with you on a quiet night into sleep. You do not need to follow any of this, of course. Let all of it go as gently as it came. The night is wide and deep, and there is all the time in the world. For a long while, it must truly have seemed that it would simply go on forever. The fleets sailing out, year upon year, and returning low in the water with the treasures of the world. The ports of half the earth learning the name of Ming China, and the name of the tall, calm admiral who came to them in peace. The great treasure ships riding the monsoon south and riding it home again, season after season after season. But it did not go on forever. Nothing does. And the way that it ended is quiet and a little sad, in just exactly the way that the truest endings so often are. The old emperor, the one who had first dreamed the whole enormous thing into being, grew old, as all men do, and at last he died. And those who came after him, who sat in their turn upon that high throne, looked out upon the great voyages with very different eyes. They saw, above all, the staggering cost of it. The vast fortunes poured into those enormous ships and into the feeding and the paying of all those tens of thousands of men who sailed away for years at a time to trade for giraffes and to carry home ambassadors and to show the world the grandeur of China. The court was full of careful, sober officials who thought, with some reason, that all that treasure would be far better spent at home. On the land, on the great rivers, on the long and troubled northern border where older enemies were stirring. And so, slowly, quietly, the will to send out the great fleets began to drain away, like water sinking into sand. There was one last voyage, the seventh, sent out years after all the others, when the admiral was already an old man. The greatest fleet in the world, sailing the long familiar road south and west, one final time. And somewhere upon that voyage, or upon the long, long journey home from it, far out upon the very sea that he had given his whole life to crossing, the admiral died. The boy from the mountains, the servant who had risen, the man who had built the greatest fleet that had ever sailed. And by the oldest tradition of the sea, they gave him to the ocean itself, and the fleet sailed on without him, home toward China, carrying the news. And that was very nearly the end of all of it. The great voyages stopped. The orders came down from the court that they were not to sail again. And the magnificent treasure ships, those floating wooden castles, with no more oceans left to cross and no more ports left to astonish, were left where they lay, at their moorings in the quiet harbors. And there, slowly, over the long years, with no one left to sail them and no reason left to mend them, they began to rot. The great hulls softened, the bright paint faded and peeled. The towering masts came down one by one, and the greatest fleet that had ever existed in all the history of the world simply sat in its own harbors, in the rain and the sun, and quietly, year by year, fell to pieces and was gone. And it is even said, though no one can be entirely sure of it, that the very records of the voyages themselves, the charts and the logs, and the careful accounts of all those far harbors and distant coasts were deliberately hidden away or even burned by officials of the court who wished the whole grand adventure to be forgotten, so that no future emperor might ever read of it and be tempted to begin the whole costly thing again. And China turned away from the sea. It turned inward, slowly, toward its own vast and ancient lands. And the great age of the treasure fleets, the age that might one day have carried Chinese ships in peace around the entire globe, simply closed and was over. And all of this happened decades, whole decades, before the first small ships of distant Europe began timidly and far away to feel their own way out down the coast of that same Africa, onto those same wide oceans, at the start of all that was to come. There is no need to feel that loss too sharply tonight. Let it be only a gentle sadness, the soft kind, the kind that loosens you and settles you, rather than the sharp kind that wakes you. The kind of quiet sadness that you can let yourself sink down into and fall asleep inside of, like sinking into a deep and well-worn chair. Because the wonder of it did not entirely vanish from the world. It never quite does. In all the ports that the great fleets had visited, the people remembered. All down the long coasts of the southern seas, in the trading towns of the islands and the straits and the far shores. The memory of the tall, calm admiral lingered and grew and softened over the centuries into something very close to legend. And to this very day, in those distant places, there are still shrines and temples that bear his name, built and tended, generation after generation, in memory of the gentle giant of a visitor who came to them from across the whole world, in his impossible ships, bearing gifts, asking nothing but friendship, and then was gone. They never forgot him. They have not forgotten him yet. And the things that he carried home, and the coasts that his navigators charted, and the simple, astonishing, undeniable fact of what was actually done, all of it has reached us. All of it has come down the long 600 years into this quiet room and this quiet night. The boy who was taken from the mountains and who went on to cross the entire known world, and who met that world not with a drawn sword, but with porcelain and silk and a deep and patient courtesy, who sailed to the ends of the earth and brought home a giraffe and called it a blessing from heaven. We remember him still. You will remember him a little, even after you have forgotten every name and every date, the way you remember the feeling of a good dream. So we need not mourn it all too much. A thing so vast and so splendid and so strangely, wonderfully gentle that we are still telling the story of it, softly on a quiet night, 6 whole centuries later, half a world away. That, in the end, is not so sad a thing at all. That is its own kind of quiet immortality. But tonight, we do not need to follow it all the way down to the rotting ships and the burned records and the long closing of the age. Tonight, we can leave him where he was happiest, out on the open water, in the great years, with the whole fleet spread around him and the warm wind in the sails and all the world still ahead. So let us go back there one last time now as you drift away to the high deck of a treasure ship, far, far out upon a calm and moonlit sea. The huge dark sails above, filled softly with the night wind, stark against a sky thick and brilliant with stars. And all around, to the very edge of sight, the other ships of the great fleet, spread wide across the gently rolling water, their lanterns small and warm and golden in the dark, rising and falling, slowly on the long ocean swell. And the man from the mountains stands quietly at the rail, as he must have stood on 1,000 nights just like this one, the warm wind moving in the rigging high above him, the soft and endless sound of the sea against the hull below, the whole vast sleeping fleet riding the slow swell beneath the turning stars, carried gently southward on the patient wind toward another dawn and another port and another quiet harbor somewhere at the far edge of the world. There is nowhere any of it needs to be tonight, and there is nowhere that you need to be either. So let the lanterns of the fleet grow dim. Let them blur and soften and fade one by one into the warm and gathering dark. Let the great sails fade away above you into the night. Let the slow sound of the water grow quieter and slower and farther away, until you can no longer quite tell the gentle rocking of the ship upon the swell from the slow and easy rise and fall of your own breathing and the deep, warm dark all around you. The sea is calm. The fleet is sleeping. The wind is warm and steady and kind. The night is deep and wide and safe, and you can let yourself go now, slowly, gently, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to be and nothing left to hold on to, all the way down, past the soft lantern light, past the dark and silent sails, past the very edge of the warm dark, all the way down, into a long and a deep and a peaceful sleep. Rest now. Good night.